Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Best, the head of MedTech for Komodo Health. We have a great hour planned for you today, discussing how data is revolutionizing sales and marketing strategies. Although we will talk a little bit about our products at Komodo Health, 90% of this will be purely educational. So here's the agenda. We'll start with intros of our presenters, followed by a couple of poll questions. We will do an overview of claims data and how data is proliferating through MedTech sales and marketing teams. Then we'll get into each of our panelists' use cases, and we'll end with audience Q&A. As I said, I'm Jim Best. I've been in healthcare for 19 years. 16 of those years were in MedTech sales, marketing, product development, product training, sales training, and I even spent a few years in MedTech venture capital and consulting. So Isabel, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yes, Isabel Boero. I'm a principal here at the Boston Consulting Group. In terms of my background, I am originally an R&D engineer from Johnson & Johnson, and then I'm a clinician as well as have received a master's in big data. Here at the Boston Consulting Group for the past 5 years, I've been focusing on leveraging data and analytics to accelerate the commercial as well as the health economics and reimbursement efforts of our MedTech clients.
Thanks, Isabel. Kiana?
Pleasure to be here on this panel today. Kiana Stewart. I'm based in New Orleans, Louisiana, and currently serve as the U.S. Commercial Director of Innovation and Strategy, supporting the ambulatory surgery center space for DePuy Synthes, an orthopedic company of Johnson & Johnson. Before joining J&J, I bring about 10 years of experience in institutional healthcare as an infectious diseases clinical pharmacist. So love data and excited for what we have in store for you today.
My name is Neil Smith. I'm currently the Director of Sales for Iterative Health. We are commercializing a variety of artificial intelligence-based platforms for gastroenterologists. My background is largely in med devices and health tech, having worked for big companies like Medtronic all the way to startups like I am here today at Iterative, but certainly to mirror the theme of the webinar today, data is considerably important for both what we're doing in the field and internally as well. I appreciate the time with each of you today.
Thanks so much, Neil. Neil, Kiana, and Isabel represent one early stage client, one big client, and one large premier strategy consulting firm that often uses our software. Our guests see data insights being used across many commercial use cases, so I'm very grateful that they're with us today. The central question today is, what insights can they derive from the data? There are about 70 answers to that question. Today, they'll just, of course, describe a few of those possibilities. Robert, can you please bring up the first poll question? All right, very good. So a pretty large majority of you guys are using data. That's good to see. I think some of the concepts that we share today are going to be pretty simple. I think that you'll find my educational portion of this in the early first few slides over the next few minutes to be perhaps a little boring for some of you guys who are already doing this, but we'll get into more advanced use cases as the hour goes on. Robert, can we do the second poll question, please? Amazing. All right, perceived accuracy is up top, and then quite a few of you guys selected cost, and then the resources, capability, and capacity. So that's helpful information for me and for our panelists as we present to you guys. So just a few quick words on Komodo. We build software that sits on top of an exceptionally large claims database. We allow companies to ask questions of the data, often without doing any coding. The underlying claims data can be augmented with race and ethnicity data, mortality data, charge master data, lab data from Quest and LabCorp, and most importantly, your data. And this can all be tied together on the patient level. So I'm going to get us kicked off with a short primer on claims data, just to educationally level set. This will be really quite simple, but it will enable your understanding of all the use cases that are presented throughout the hour, especially if you are not currently using data. So there is a lot of complexity in healthcare data. This chart outlines 66 different types of healthcare data. Although Komodo has several of these data types, the real backbone of our healthcare map is health insurance claims. Medical claims come from physicians and facilities, and of course, pharmacies use claims too. The medical claims are useful to all med tech companies, while companies whose product has a drug-related indication or contraindication will typically use the pharmacy claims as well. So these are the 4 broad categories of health insurers. What I really want to highlight here is just some lingo. When we refer to commercial claims, we're talking about everything except Medicare, Medicaid, or military insurance. So in other words, all the private insurers out there who run HMOs, PPOs, etc. Let's discuss some of the key fields in a medical claim. Here are some of the provider fields. Note that we say clinician here because our data covers any clinician type with an NPI. That is anyone who can diagnose, treat, or monitor patients and bill for their services. So it's not just physicians or surgeons, but it's also NPs, PAs, physical therapists, etc. These are 2 key fields on the insurer itself. Again, this isn't every field we see in the claims, just the really important ones. So this is really where the meat is at the patient level. Note that companies like ours only see year of birth, not date of birth, and only the first 3 digits of a patient's zip code. So patient re-identification is impossible. That middle column is key. What are the diagnoses? What procedures have been performed? Have any HCPCS codes been billed yet? And then finally, we see the dates of those events and some enrollment data. If you're thinking this is really obvious so far, hang on, it's about to get juicier going forward. For my last portion here, I want to go through how medical claims flow through our healthcare system. And this is really key if you're struggling with perceived data accuracy. We're going to start to get into some of that here. In the simplest scenario, the claim goes from provider to payer and back to provider with an approval, a preliminary denial, or an outright rejection. But there are almost always these intermediaries and clearinghouses that generate, clean, and submit claims on the provider's behalf. So when claims are purchased from these entities, the provider, intermediary, or clearinghouse, we call them open or basic claims. Although these claims arrive quickly, we can't really rely on them for completeness or accuracy because the payer hasn't had the final word yet. Moreover, they don't include the patient's enrollment data, which often includes their demographic data. We also buy claims directly from the payers at Komodo. We actually have claims for 170 million patients at this stage. These claims are called closed, payer complete, adjudicated, or non-commodity claims. Now, these claims have 2 very important characteristics. First, the payer's decision has been made, so they are completely accurate. Second, with these non-commodity data sets, we see every healthcare encounter for every patient while they are enrolled with that insurer. I'll repeat that. We see every healthcare encounter for every patient while they are enrolled with that insurer. Importantly, this means that if an event didn't occur, we know that it did not occur in real life. If you only use open claims and you don't see a claim with a certain procedure or diagnosis, you cannot guarantee that the event did not happen. So to review, the open claims come quickly, but they are less accurate. Meanwhile, the non-commodity claims are accurate and good for virtually every use case. The downside is simply that they are expensive and they come with a bit of lag. They come later than the open claims. It's these non-commodity claims, particularly for commercial insurance, that make Komodo attractive to companies such as Iterative Health, DePuy Synthes, and BCG. So that's it for me. I'm going to turn it over now to Isabel Buero, who will give a landscape overview of how the digital transformation is unfolding in medtech. Isabel?
Thank you, Jim. So just to briefly walk through, this is just to set the scene about what we see happening in terms of the broader medtech landscape in terms of digital and data analytics. I don't think it comes to a surprise to anyone on this call that data and digital are going to shape healthcare of the future. We asked industry experts, what they see as critical healthcare trends, and you can see all the ones in pink and debatably even some of the ones in blue. Data, digital are going to play a core role, whether it's driving more value-based healthcare, whether it's offering more digital services and solutions. It's here, it's going to be shaping the industry, and it's going to be exciting to see where it goes. We also at the same time, asked medtech clients, what is the scope of their data and digital transformations ongoing? And I will say that there's a broad array of investments taking place. We see a lot as internal. So you can see the top one is digitizing support functions, but also that at least 60% of our medtech leaders are looking at ways to bring in more digital and data in terms of customer experience and journeys, and as well as sales and marketing acceleration efforts. So it's coming. I will flag that, going on to the next slide, if we asked our same medtech clients to rate their capabilities, it's evolving. So this was a survey done to judge commercial capabilities. And as you can make out on the bottom square, which I apologize is extremely tiny, you can see that most of our medtech clients as an industry average are rating themselves as basic across key digital and data capabilities. So it's coming, and companies who are better able to take advantage of this trend are going to be ones who can, we'd expect would make commercials have greater likelihood of commercial success. Field's still open. No one's a clear winner, though there are some people who are more advanced than others. As a final point, and this just highlights what was previously mentioned, this is comparing, the digital and data maturity between medtech, who's the green little circle, pharma, who's the blue, and provider, who's the red with the heart. As you can see, medtech does tend to trail pharma. So if you look at sales and marketing acceleration, which is highlighted in yellow on the third row, we see medtech above provider, but still lagging on where pharma is. Likewise, if we look at marketing and dynamic pricing, we see medtech a little bit before payers and as well as biopharma, but not markedly. And you can just see across the skew that in general, except for new business ventures, where I will call out medtech's ahead, we do see medtech, is a little bit more nascent in its journey. However, that is changing, as I don't think is a surprise. This was a survey done to understand where medtech clients are allocating their funding. And as you can see, AI and big data was mentioned by 83% of the medtech participants in this survey. And it was felt to be, about 20% of the funding going forward. So we're definitely going to expect more investment in this space and more clients and medtech players here seeing how they can leverage in data into their commercial capabilities. As a pivot, we'll be going into a little bit though what are the challenges that medtech might face with data, especially when thinking about things like claims. I'm going to skip ahead one more slide because we're going to touch upon this, and Jim has already started highlighting it about the denominator and closed denominator, how it makes a difference in what you're able to analyze. So if you'll just bear with me. In terms of challenges that we see for medtech in big data, there's sort of three big buckets. The first one is the data itself. The second is the analytics. And then the third, which is actually sometimes ends up being the bigger issue, is the organization. But to go back to the first one, I think that, in our experience, there's been some challenges in terms of what data can, that medtech can leverage. If you think about a drug has a clear drug code that you can use in the pharmacy claims that Jem mentioned to find the drug. In medtech, we can't do that. You can look up a knee replacement, but I don't know whether it was a DePuy Synthes or a Stryker. Ablation, whether it was, Medtronic, Boston Scientific. So we do not have the same resolution at share that pharma can leverage often with claim sets. So that's just an acknowledged limitation often when you're working with claims. There are some sets and some linkages that can help work around that, but that does tend to be a challenge. There's also, and this is more into, I'll group the two together, but there's limited visibility into certain things that are important for medtech clients. For example, if you need a CRT, implantable defibrillator, you have to have a certain type of heart failure. Claims don't identify that certain type of heart failure. Likewise, if you're on an inpatient stay and you're getting a blood draw, you're getting a PICC put in, a catheter, you are not going to see that because the billing goes through the DRG and it, doesn't specify like nurse put in catheter. So there's a little bit more limited visibility into patient severity, which pharma also has an issue with, as well as like what happens when a patient is hospitalized, which impacts a lot of, when a commodity, a medtech player who has more of the hospital, commodity devices and therapies is considering it. At the same time, depending on what linkages there is, there can be limited insight into lab data, imaging data, which is often critical for the fields like oncology and mortality. But, if your set has the right linkages, that can be addressed. It just might take down the number of people you can comment on. And then on occasion, Part D drugs can be gappy in terms and end up more missing than when you're injecting one, which can make a difference if you're trying to find like a certain population who has failed drugs. In terms of analytically, this is getting to the point on the previous side of the denominator. If you just need to know how many procedures took place in the United States in a year, open claims are fine. Get a pulse check, see how many occurred. If you want to understand questions such as what share of indicated or eligible patients received my device therapy, whether it be a knee, a neurostimulator, a cardiac stent, you need to identify the right denominator and make sure that you're not commenting on a cohort that has missing data in order to get a correct answer. For example, if you have a group of 100 patients and 50 of them are missing data, you're often going to end up with like treatment rates that are well below the actual treatment rates or just skewed because you're including people who aren't actually a fair comparison. So extremely important if you're doing HEOR studies, trying to find the right patient, commenting on any sort of market sizing or opportunity where a patient pathway is involved, to have a closed set. Otherwise, you just have a huge risk of introducing error because of missing data. There's also a challenge in terms of, if there's, and I'll talk faster because I know we're running out of time, but, adjusting. No set, unfortunately, in the US is 100%. There are some sets with stronger coverage with commercial than others. Medicare often does not share its data completely unless you're a qualified entity with a lot more of the commercial claims provider. So you're always, if you get 50 procedures per a site, you are often going to have to think about how you adjust up in order to represent the full market, because with any claim set, the full market is typically not there. I think everyone's making a great effort to bring it together, but unfortunately we're not quite there in the US to having one universal source of truth. So it is important, you are going to have to make assumptions and adjustments, which can raise questions, and almost ties to the third part, which I think we're going to get some great examples in following. So I'm going to not deep dive here, but a lot of I'd have to say the analytics and the data often end up 20 to 30% of the challenge. The organization can be 70% because data in itself does not drive change. It can point you in the right direction. It can help identify opportunities, but unless the commercial team, the marketing team, leadership are willing to act, accept, and invest in making data part of how they operate, it often ends up, a nice science research, but not something that is taken forward and really drives the change that this can cause when produced with the buy-in and sort of organizational support for these next generation tools and techniques. And now turning it over to Neil, who will describe one success story of where organizations do involve data and analytics and the impact it can make.
Great, thanks, Isabel. So as I said earlier, we are Iterative Health, and we're commercializing a number of artificial intelligence platforms for gastroenterologists. So just as context for our use cases, think about it in the sense, if you're a gastroenterologist and a 50-year-old Hispanic male walks into your office with XYZ comorbid conditions and on X, Y, and Z medications, you're able to, using artificial intelligence, and I'm thinking big picture here, assess that patient in the terms of 100,000 other cases and relate it to those, as opposed to, say, the handful in your head. And that's where we're going. But I mentioned my background earlier, and much of that is in very early stage technologies, which are a great place to be, but also can be challenging because there's absolutely no historical data associated with those internally. So you have to really rely on external data sources to help guide you as you commercialize those. And us at Iterative Health have certainly seen that to be the case inherently as well. So the first entry point for us to this market is IBD, so inflammatory bowel disorder, and which is a very specific subset of gastroenterology. And I'd mentioned those challenges, and we certainly see those as well. So, with a very specific call point, sometimes we may not have the relationships, say, with an IBD specialist. And taking it an even step further, we call on IBD specialists doing clinical research, which is even more specific, which is a challenge. Sometimes those champions are not visible to our reps or to the market as a whole, and we have to investigate and understand who they are and how we get to them. I'd mentioned not having a historical base of business off which to pull, and we're certainly seeing that here at Iterative Health as well. A common challenge amongst the entire industry is just the days of doctors wanting a technology and bringing it in have gone by the wayside. It involves multiple stakeholders to be on board with bringing your technology on board before it happens. And then lastly, really with an early stage technology, and certainly what we've seen here at Iterative Health, there's not a playbook where our team is writing that playbook, which can take some time. And so really our challenge is how do we leverage data and how we use that data in a way that accelerates that commercialization and sales process. And I'll say everything that we've worked, and I'm going to speak specifically to Komodo because they've been extremely empowering for what we're doing with regards to targeting and our commercialization efforts. It's helped an immense amount. So I mentioned a very specific call point in IBD and clinical research. And I think in the poll at the beginning, it mentioned perceived accuracy. I can say that has been one of the most empowering aspects of this platform, is just how specific and how accurate the data is. So when we go to that target that we identify on Komodo, I have trust and faith that my team is going to speak to the right person because the data is extremely accurate. We're able to get to those doctors much more quickly than either looking online through just public information, i.e. the website, or investigating with our current customers or current relationships. We're able to go straight to those people and those targets in a much quicker way. It actually mirrors what we may have done in our past, which is going to a relationship that you may have currently, identifying this next market segment that we're going to be going into, asking who we should speak to, and then we go talk to them. We can actually just go right to that person based upon the targeting data that we're using from Komodo, and it has accelerated things considerably. I'm going to talk in the next slide a little bit about how referral networks are growing the size of our deals. And then lastly, in this specific use case, I'd mentioned our team having to write that playbook. What I have appreciated about platforms like Komodo is it allows our team the ability to not manipulate the data, but filter the data and assess the data, look at it in their own way. So they can get creative, they can think outside the box. And if somebody pursues, say, a certain pathway that they found through that database and through searches, and it works, we can leverage that with the rest of the team. But it requires much more flexibility from a database than just, okay, here's a list and a script, go do it. It requires much more flexibility and openness for our team to think outside the box with it. From a bigger picture standpoint, I'd mentioned what we're trying to get to, really the idea for us as a company from a mission and vision standpoint. And that's what I like about this use case. It aligns kind of the first step in that process with a big picture mission. Our CEO came from Singapore and saw what are enormously large gap in healthcare disparities across the globe. And that's our goal as a company is to reduce that gap. Is to bring the people in underserved areas of the globe and pull them up to, say, an academic medical center in the United States, and using technology in a novel way to do that. The first step in that process that we're working on, actually, we learned from a use case from Dartmouth, where there was an IBD specialist there that's going to underserved and rural communities throughout the Northeast and now throughout the country, leveraging technology. In this case, it was more telemedicine than AI. And then thus rising up the level of IBD care in those rural and underserved markets. So we're thinking, how can we do that on our end using artificial intelligence And the referral networks and the data that we're able to get through Komodo is extremely empowering in doing so. So use case in Dallas, where we have an IBD specialist who does clinical research, we're able to see where they get their referrals from today, and in turn also pursue those referring facilities with our technology as well. So we're increasing the level of care at those ancillary facilities, maybe that aren't as good at IBD as the specialists that we work with, potentially send that patient with more data than they would have without having used our service and our technology in their referring center, and really increasing overall network care beyond just that one single site. But it's something that's extremely exciting for us, and I think speaks to the future of this and what we can accomplish by leveraging both technology and market data as well. So, and I will kick it over to Kiana.
Thanks so much, Neil. I'm going to pick up with kind of how do you execute, right? Data for the sake of data is awesome for those of us that live in the world that just love to pivot table and build Tableau sheets and talk about the possibilities. Coming from the research arm of things, that is where I've lived. What I've learned in our experience with leveraging the data is really how do you get from that to execution? So one way you get from data as a theoretical benefit to execution is starting to think about business questions that need answering and potentially use of third-party claims data can help us achieve. In the pharma sector, as Isabel pointed out so poignantly, we frequently look to large-scale third-party data sets to help us understand more about a patient base. In medtech, sometimes this means being clear about what the directional capabilities of seeing the data looks like and how do you apply that to those business questions. So within DePuy Synthes, as we think about the evolving and rapidly changing dynamic that occurs in ambulatory surgery centers, there's a need to respond quickly. And as much as reliance as we place on our field teams, the reality is they can't be everything and everyone to everybody at all times while maintaining their high level of clinical expertise. So we started answering business questions. For the ASC space, it was clear that as the market expands, we need to be able to allocate instruments in a certain way. But how do we measure migration? What directionally can show us the care trends in terms of where cases are happening, and how does that migratory pattern impact our businesses? Leveraging the data to give us a directional stronghold on what that might look like instead of just pulling from anecdotes was the first step in getting our organization to understand, perhaps we can use third-party data to help us answer some questions. In tandem with that effort, we started leveraging the third-party data for a segmentation effort within the ambulatory surgery center space. So in terms of segmentation and targeting, bread and butter marketing 101, you got to understand your customer and you've got to be able to bucket them or group like with like. Leveraging the third-party data allowed us to use that information in tandem with our internal data, right? This is when you're really harnessing the power, right? Closing that Swiss cheese model to really see what does the market look like and what do we as a company look like, because claims are not going to give us that data, right? Isabel pointed out, you can't really differentiate manufacturer, but the power is really harnessed when you combine these data efforts. Our next step, once we had gotten some buy-in on maybe the data is accurate, yep, this helped me answer this question and this led to this outcome internally, was really thinking about how do we look at the process of organizing the data, so to speak, and decide, do we vet it from our lens of what we think is important in the market, or do we allow it to guide us in combination with our data? And we ultimately decided to take that unsupervised clustering approach, which then led to clean clusters. And this is just one example of the businesses that we provided this for, of who are the customers that are performing joint replacement cases in the ASC across the country, and how do we want to show up differently? And this is when you start to get into enabling a toolkit for success for our field. So what we've been able to realize from that segmentation, leveraging the third-party claims data within Komodo, is really for our field teams, helping them prioritize their bandwidth. While we would love to believe that our 5,000 sales force could go everywhere all the time and be in every late-breaking case and meet every need, the reality is that they can't do that and grow the business. So helping direct them towards additional opportunities and vetting that with them is really helpful. This is a shared decision point. Claims data isn't going to tell your FSO what they need to do and how they need to do it. And relationships are still very, very important in the medtech space. But empowering them to be able to prioritize their time for those highest hanging fruit or lowest hanging fruit and flex their time has been really beneficial for us. The other thing is empowering our leaders to be able to proactively target the right accounts with the right resources at the right time by providing them with a directional footprint of what might be going on in that landscape in their area. And then internally, there are a lot of ways that we've been able to leverage the segmentation results to really help drive our marketing strategies, help us shape for certain customer segments, and help us understand those referral patterns that Neil talked about and how it may impact our business depending on how we enact the appropriate thresholds, what the change in procedural volume has been at site of care, and so on and so forth. The other ways that we've been able to do this, as you can tell, is really a piecemeal fashion, right? Everybody's not going to get on the bus at the same time, and that's fine. We've got to meet the need of the business and show use cases for how the data can be leveraged. Another example of that is really vetting our own assumptions about advisory board components. What really is the workload of our surgeons across sites of care? Should we be leveraging certain surgeons more than others in terms of being those experts in that site of care where it's so important to find out what the nuanced differences are? So leveraging the Komodo tools, our data science teams were able to do a workload distribution to display for us, and this is an example for our spine business, really to show what are the changes in volume for those surgeons across HOPD, so hospital outpatient departments, ASCs, ambulatory surgery centers, and their inpatient volume. This is a very helpful tool to help us vet our assumptions and make sure that we're selecting the appropriate surgeons to help us learn more about the space when we're in the grassroots efforts of trying to figure out how do we want to show up differently, particularly in my space upstream where we're trying to figure out how do we shape the future? What do we need to be doing next? What do we need to think about doing after the next thing? It's really important to make sure we've got the right distribution of input, assuring that they're in the site of care that we desire. So that's another use case. And then the last use case I'll leave you all with is kind of a passion project for us within Johnson & Johnson and our Race to Health Equity. They've challenged all of our businesses from end to end to really think about how are we approaching health disparities and what could we do differently? And this is where really harnessing the power of third-party data in conjunction with what we know and what's in the literature can really have the potential to be impactful if you think outside the box. So in this scenario, what we're actively working on is really, we understand the landscape with our HEMA partners that are heavily involved in this work and HECOR partners, really understanding knee osteoarthritis and what does that look like in terms of disparities? How could we maybe approach that in a different way if we take the geographic data we have and third-party claims data? Could we start to envision a state where we could think about new approaches to aid in improving those statistics and leveraging the new data capabilities? So everyone kind of got on board with, well, let's see, what do you mean? Tell me more. And so through the partnership between our data and analytics teams, our data science teams, HEMA, and our Komodo customer success agents, we were able to take our segmentation and think past what we believe to be true to then say, we've got zip code information, we've got commercial claims data, we've got Medicare claims data, we've got location, we've got sites. And then internally, we've been looking at the disparity deciles for certain disease states. The one picture here is for total knee replacements, where the highest number is the highest level of disparity between the two predominant racial or ethnic groups in a given territory. And then the lowest is the lowest disparity. What if we could envision a state where we could leverage these data to target areas of greatest need, where there's a high disparity index or decile, and then start to craft an intervention aimed at bringing more of those patients into sites of care that are delaying care and targeting educational efforts and the like to try and dissuade or improve health equity overall. So these are some of the few examples that we can bring to life some of the data in actionable and insightful ways, But the caveat is you have to be very upfront with your teams about what the tools are and what they're not. If you give someone a hammer and they don't know how to use it, it's going to be problematic. And so we've learned that along the way. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Isabel, who will kind of close this out.
Analytics goes. It only does so much. You have to take it the rest of the way. This is an example from a cardiac medtech client who really leveraged both EMR data, so I'll use the electronic medical records, and claims data in order to understand where there were opportunities, map it out, where was the gaps, who was driving the gaps, segment providers and systems, and then use that as a foundation for a outreach and education strategy more in a market development level. I will flag, I wish I had had Komodo for this project because a lot of time was spent cleaning the claims that I did use here. So there is value in having a complete denominator. I will just flag it. It helps make data and analytics efforts much, much, much easier. Is, just to go through this example, one of the first things that we did was, this was within the EMR set. So this was electronic medical records, but you could take a similar view within claims. And basically for the first time, we were able to show our client what was the actual treatment rate across the cardiac diseases they treated. And it was actually extremely surprising for them because they had previously existed in a world of the physicians telling them, I refer all the patients. It's just the sick patients I don't send. There's a few elderly patients. And then we met and mapped out the underlying patient pool by the actual treatment rates and found that the story was anything but. So, this was an opportunity where data really provided a new insight in the field and actually pivoted how this particular client was thinking about their market development strategy. It was no longer a diagnostics issue, it was a recognition issue. As next step from there, understanding this was still done in an EMR data set, but what we began to do was map out the patient journey and understand where people fell out of the system, who they saw, the ones that had died, so that we could really get a sense about where were the pain points and where were the, funnel constriction points and what were the ultimate outcomes. This work eventually fed into multiple papers that were then generated off of it, but also made the organization excited about our later claims work, where we went to go find the providers who were responsible for not referring patients forward so that they could be considered for, targeted outreach, targeted education, and help improve care of this cardiac disease. And this is, as you see the Sankey, closed data, complete understanding, making sure you have a good denominator is critical for producing accurate figures such as these. This was, to go back, this was one of the segmentations that we did in claim sets because we could map providers and understand how many patients of a certain disease indication they were treating, what was their current treatment rate, what was their current referral rate, how far did they get along the patient pathway. We could segment out the market into physicians who had more of the patients and were, showing the, clinically appropriate behaviors, and those ones that were, dabbling in referring patients forward to therapy. So as mentioned earlier, this gives you an idea where to hunt or where to target or where to go talk. It doesn't help you understand, you still have to think about what is the behaviors that drive each segment in order if you want to craft execution. But this is a great tool of understanding who you should go to and who you should focus on. As a final step to this story, and this is, one, going back to one of the challenges I highlighted, which is oftentimes we cannot find the right severity patient because that is not available in claims. This was an exciting example tied to this previous story, where what we did was we actually, leveraging an electronic medical record, developed a claims algorithm that could then be run in our claims set to find the certain type of patient that we needed to find. It wasn't 100% perfect, but it was going to be 70% right, so that instead of looking, for example, all heart failure patients, we could look for all heart failure patients with an EF less than 35, let's say CRT, who had a QRS of the right duration. So there are ways to combine EMR sets with claim sets to almost do an double unlock to the sorts of patient groups that you're specifically looking at in order to address some of the challenges that medtech providers face. So you could theoretically get down to patients indicated for CRT, patients who are indicated for neuromodulation by developing algorithms in other sets that can then be run in claims. There's also a little bit more informal ways to do it in claims, but there is ways to unlock things. What we did with that was we were then able to map it to all managing providers and actually create a real-time heat map of, where were these patients upstream in the pathway being managed? So you could think about targeting CME, you could think about targeting therapy development representatives, and really help bridge from a, referring provider to the ultimate treatment center or, implanter or surgeon who can then do a procedure, which is often a dynamic that you see in medtech. Now, so turning it over to Jim to close us off.
Thanks a lot, Isabel. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Kiana. That was all fantastic. I love it. We're going to put out one more poll question. Robert, if you want to go ahead and do that. Just want to see where people's heads are at after seeing that. And that may inform some of our questions going forward for our audience Q&A. And it may help our panelists give a little more color on where we're going. So, all right, very cool. So this certainly speaks to me and my background as a sales leader. Gosh, optimizing where the sales folks are is an immense challenge when you're sort of working from a blind perspective. So this is super interesting, and the profiling and targeting absolutely resonates as well. So thank you guys for responding to those polls. We're going to kick it over now to one of my colleagues, Sagar Thakur, who is going to help us out with the audience Q&A. Sagar, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Jim. Excited to be here with everyone. I will encourage, if there are additional questions, please go ahead and send them to us, and we'll try to get them answered with our panelists here today. I'm going to throw out a first question here for Neil. Neil, you spoke to the accuracy. I think some of the challenges that Isabel highlighted, you've seen success with in terms of accuracy, quickness. You also mentioned you're writing the playbook actively. What I wanted to understand, is resources. I'm sure that was highlighted as a challenge for some of our individuals on the call in terms of using data. With limited resources, how do you actually handle the amount of time it takes to ingest and analyze the data so that it can be, part of your playbook and used for execution?
Yeah, good question, and I think it's actually twofold. So I'm kind of from a top down and then bottom up. So we brought in Komodo right when I was coming into the organization, and so really it was being rolled out, or I was rolling it out at the same time as the organization. And what I came to appreciate is our sales ops team and our internal team that set it up had a very focused data set. So me coming in, not knowing what I didn't know, it was a case of, it was like, oh, I'd love for it to do this, or I'd love for it to do this. But they put a lot of work on the front end to get a very targeted data set for our team to work. And as we started to implement, I saw the wisdom in that, because we didn't get caught up in data sets and databases and lists that just really didn't matter. We were only working with the data sets that really did. And so it was that work from our sales ops team on the front end that really dialed it in with what we were using. And then secondly, I'd say it was really culturally, which is for our sales team to know, okay, it's your job to go and really dig into this data. And so as we think about resources, our people are going to be our best resources. And if we can multiply, if I have a team of 15, then at that point, we're multiplying those resources by an X of 15, not by one, because each person is going out and trying to figure out that data in their own way. And so in turn, it actually accelerates the output with minimal resources, beyond our people and the platform with which we're working with.
So continued efficiency and value gets delivered and layered on there. That's fantastic, Neil. Appreciate that. Isabel, I've got a question for you. And you highlighted, it was great to hear about the different challenges. You highlighted some of the challenges with the data itself, particularly some of the granularity that might be valuable for industry to develop insights around. So, a couple part question here, but what are the most common pieces of data that you're actually using for your customers? There's a range of data within the healthcare map, but what are the most common ones you're actually using? And I may have some follow-ups for you on that.
Yeah, so just to, at a baseline, the procedure codes, the CPT codes, the clinician names, and then the diagnosis codes are almost core. I'd say depending on what sort of project it is, that determines then the next sets we add in. Mortality is extremely important. If you're doing any sort of, you want to publish off research, really critical if you're thinking about health economics or outcome studies to have mortality. Likewise, race and ethnicity is becoming a nice variable, especially to have there that we can add on that level of understanding. At the same time, also race and mortality can really help you understand your targeting, because you don't want to go somewhere where half the patients have already passed away. You would like to go somewhere where, ideally there's more people you can find to influence care. Likewise, it does show a dynamic of, if we are addressing gaps in care, which I think you highlighted really nicely, Kayana, just, using this as a tool to begin pointing in the right direction. I've had personally less use of laboratory and charge master data, but it's more because I've been working on the, market assessments and targeting of patients where we, a lot of it is much more of ICD codes and procedure codes.
And maybe just a follow up, one of the questions we received was asking maybe for clarification. You mentioned the ability to identify specific devices and some of the differences between med device and the pharmaceutical space. Maybe just a short clarification on that. Are there any types of data that help you identify more specifically exact brands and getting that more granular piece of information?
Yes, there is some data sets, SG2, which does sell invoice data for various healthcare systems, so you can actually see medtech devices or in vitro tests. It is blinded though, so you can't tell which center, but you can get a little bit of geographic area. If you can backlink to your data, you can sort of also get a little bit of a view. It's not perfect. That's still a big gap within the medtech industry. Pharma, on the other hand, every time a claim goes through, it has the name, it has the NDC code. You can track it. You can track the dose, the manufacturer. So I think we're still EMR data, it will really be the golden unlock here, because in the EMR systems is a lot of that, device type, SKU data that would be extremely insightful. I'd have to say, especially if it could be mapped to system, we're still waiting for that. It'd be fantastic when that happens.
Okay.
Looking forward to it.
And that is one area that I will say Komodo is working on pulling EHR, EMR data into the healthcare map. So that may be an evolution we may see in the future. And thank you for sharing some of the areas that might create some of that value. Kiana, I'd love to ask a question here from the audience that we got. You mentioned a lot of areas of success with data that your organization has had. Are there any areas that you've struggled in terms of making decisions when it comes to the ASC data that you're working with?
Great question. Happy to answer. Lots of hits and misses along this journey and still have them. I will say the key component is the directional nature. So oftentimes when people get excited about the data, they're like, oh my God, I can see all of this. There's this attempt to want to then say, oh, well, let me quantify the total available market. And let me start to do these other things with the data, when some of the conversations that we've had throughout the webinar about the denominator is important. Have level setting with our partners about what it is and what it's not is the key to getting past that stopcock each time. But it's the over extrapolation of data, which I think it's an inherent issue anytime you're dealing with any data sets, right? Regardless of third-party data. If we were in a clinical study, it's the same thing. It's the over extrapolation of the data, which is sometimes a cautionary tale.
And maybe a follow-up to that, obviously a lot of successes, some potential challenges that your organization's overcoming. When you think about the journey, and you spoke to this in terms of championing the change in culture and making data central to that, for a lot of organizations, getting that buy-in may be a challenge. Any additional thoughts you can share around how you got leadership buy-in to actually use third-party data, and what really helped drive the alignment for the organization to move forward with that?
Yeah, so I was lucky that I inherited the role when we had inherited the data. We were in our early stages. And so once we make an investment, we've got to prove, right? The proof is in the pudding. How are you leveraging this? And so we took that on as a challenge from the innovation team, really to say, how can we? Let's see what we can do with it. And so I think we've kept our leaders abreast of what's going on each step of the way. So it's been a lot of man hours, not just from our data science teams, but frankly from ourselves, having touch points, sometimes twice weekly, going across leaders, across franchises, across platforms, reiterating what it is, what it's not, what we've been able to do, developing strategy to say, this might be how you want to use it, reinventing the wheel, so to speak, which is something we don't usually encourage, but we've had to, right? Maybe we have a different approach to leveraging the data for our joint reconstruction partners than we do from our trauma extremities or our spine business, right? So it's been early and often engagements and allowing people to question the data. I always say, challenge it, ask us. We will go back, we will ask the teams, we will fill in gaps, but allowing teams to challenge the data is really what's really been helpful in getting that buy-in.
Isabel described the journey that medtech device teams are on, and it, based on what you just described, seems you guys are well on the way in that journey. So thank you. I'd love to ask about the customer in mind and the customer experience. So maybe for Neil and Kiana, how are you using data to improve the customer experience? And Neil, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, it's I think largely a reinforcement of one of the examples that I gave before, that kind of a hub and spoke model using the referral network data really came from that, with existing customers, understanding who they work with, and then in turn who we can approach from a sale. I mean, I'm a sales guy, and so I look at everything from a sales perspective, and thus that's how can we get more customers. And so even from our existing customers, using that data to understand their referral networks and then approach those people in those organizations, it's proving extremely helpful, at least from my standpoint.
Thank you. Kiana, any thoughts on how the customer experience is evolving thanks to some of the data that you guys are leveraging?
Teams and activating their use of the data, the next phase of kind of what we're trying to do. I think some of it we did detail with kind of the health equity plays and how we might partner with them to improve health equity, using the data as our directional kind of compass for where those opportunities may be greatest. The other kind of planned future strategies we have around leveraging the data to improve the customer experience is really in how we show up from a contracting and pricing perspective. Now that we've got the segmentation underway and some guardrails around, what's the average procedure volume year over year, how does that change? It allows us to show up more knowledgeable for that customer, particularly in the ASC space, where we can be very siloed because we're growing our business in one area, but in ASCs, it's all coming together. And so knowing how that's coming together across businesses helps us show up differently for that customer and a little bit more knowledgeable sometimes about what else might be happening outside of our silo area of expertise.
So thank you. Really helpful. A lot of great questions here. I'm going to end with one, and I'll ask all our panelists, and we'll try to keep it brief, but in a kind of a short, paraphrased way. The question is, how do you think leveraging data and technology will change the med device industry when we look 3 to 5 years from now? What does that look like to you? And Isabel, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, I'd hope and imagine that more and more of our medtech clients are using data in order to direct and sort of understand where to do outreach, but also begin to go upstream in the patient path. So understand where is opportunities to educate in advance. I'm also would be super excited to see it leveraged into forecasting. we have enough data to begin to understand how patients are migrating through the system. So I think we can get a lot more smarter, predictive, and better calibrated to what's actually happening in our healthcare system. That is really where I'd hope that data can play in, that we're not doing a survey. We have some real directional answers that are showing us a snapshot of about where we really are.
That's actually having reality for the teams to be able to see in front of them. Neil, can I ask you to go next?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting. I actually heard it from each of the other panelists, which was reducing the disparities in healthcare. And I think, identifying whether it's socioeconomic areas or regional areas or wherever it may be, reducing that disparity seems to be a common theme across this industry, and something that I have an immense amount of optimism for and what it can do in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Neil. Kiana, I'll end with you, and this will be our last answer here.
So I echo the comments that have been shared. The patient journey is going to be an interesting one as it evolves. But if I zoom out, I think it's the integration of that journey towards leveraging machine learning models in a different way to drive commercial strategies for medtech. I think we do it on the R&D side in medtech, but bringing that to the commercial organization and decisions that are made, that's kind of the next terrain, I believe, when we all embrace this. So,
sounds like a bright future with lots of transformation happening. So thank you all. Jim, I'll give it back to you.
All right, that's it. Neil Smith, Kiana Stewart, Isabel Boero, wonderful jobs. So much hard work on this. We truly appreciate it. Get in touch with us at komodohealth.com/medtech. You can also email me with any follow-up questions that you'd like. Thank you all for attending.